Welcome and thank you for listening to Evangel Temple's podcast. We're glad you're here. We hope you enjoy today's sermon.
I just want to point that out. Man, remember that there used to be a day where we would take time to let somebody walk onto a TV show and change their shoes. That's crazy. So, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. If you're a member of my generation, that video probably brought back some good memories. You know what? It might be cheesy by today's standards, and it probably was even a little cheesy by the 1980s standards, but it taught us great lessons about developing character. Fred Rogers created and hosted Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood from 1968 to 2001. And that was actually Fred Rogers. That wasn't Tom Hanks, by the way. Rogers received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, 40 honorary degrees, and a Peabody Award. He was included into the Television Hall of Fame, and he was recognized by 2 congressional resolutions, was ranked 35 among TV Guide's 50 greatest TV stars of all time, and the Smithsonian Institute has on display one of his sweaters as a treasure of American history. But what you may not know about Mr. Rogers is that he earned a degree in children's ministry from Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, and he was an ordained minister with the Presbyterian Church. And so he never led a church, but he viewed his children's program that ran for 33 years as his ministry. And I think that it would be safe to say that someone who had a seminary degree might have had the parable of the Good Samaritan in mind when he wrote a theme song that asked the question, "Won't you be my neighbor?" Listen to what Fred Rogers said one time. "We live in a world in which we need to share responsibility. It's easy to say, it's not my child, not my community, not my world, not my problem. Then there are those who see the need and respond. I consider those people my heroes." And the parable of the Good Samaritan calls us to see the need and respond. It teaches us that the life and the actions of every follower of Jesus should look a certain way. The parable of the Good Samaritan might be the most famous parable, not only that Jesus taught, but that anyone ever taught. It has become part of our culture and part of our vocabulary. We talk about someone who's a good Samaritan. People that don't even know that they know this story talk about a good Samaritan. In fact, tourists can still find the inn of the Good Samaritan halfway between Jerusalem and Jericho. It's that level of impact on our culture. So we're going to examine this really, really popular parable today. We're going to begin by looking into the parable itself. So we're going to break it down into a couple of different things. We're going to look at the parable, then we're going to look around the parable. But we're going to start with the parable itself. With such a famous story, a lot of times we assume that we know all that there is to know about it. The first truth that we need to understand from this parable is that titles and positions should have no influence on what we do. Titles and position should have no influence on what we do. So let's look at the parable. In Luke 10, we're going to begin in verse number 30. It says, "Jesus replied, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion." So Jesus did an amazing job of introducing characters into the story who would have made the original hearers think they knew exactly what was going to happen. So have you ever watched a movie or read a book or listened to a story and you just knew what was going to happen? Like somebody came in and you're like, oh, I know what's going to happen here. This is what Jesus is doing. He is setting the story up in a way that people that are listening think, well, I know exactly how this is going to turn out. So he clearly defines the characters for us, and it's important that we understand who they are so we can understand what he was teaching. And he began the story with the man who was robbed. And this person is described in the most generic terms possible. The word that is translated man in Greek is anthropos, and it means a person or a human being. That's it. It is where our word anthropology or the study of humanity comes from. This person is an everyman character. He has no face. He is given no name. He is simply humanity in its broken state. That's all we know about him. All we know is that this is a person who is in trouble. And that's all we need to know. The next people that Jesus introduced are the priest and the Levite. And there are some distinctions between the two, but they both serve as religious leaders in Judaism, and they both serve at the temple. The primary distinction between them would be that the priests are direct descendants of Aaron and can therefore serve as priests. The Levites came from the tribe of Levi, but they were not descended from Aaron in the tribe of Levi, and so they were not able to offer sacrifices. They weren't able to go into the holier places in the temple. They did other work around the temple. But their entire lives, whether they were priests or Levites, were associated with the worship of God, with the service to God's people. And both the priest and the Levite would have been people of very high standing in the culture of Jesus' day, because no one chose to be a priest or a Levite. They were literally born into it. And so the people of that day considered them favored by God for being born into a position of holiness and righteousness. They didn't choose it, God chose them for it. And so when people saw them, they revered them because of the position that they were in. And this is actually one of the attitudes that Jesus is trying to combat. He's trying to get us to understand it doesn't matter what you've been born into. We're not blessed and favored by God based on our family history, but rather or not, our lives have been transformed and we live in obedience to God and mercy to other people. So it doesn't matter who your mom or your dad are. It doesn't matter what side of the town you grew up on. It doesn't even matter if you're from Oklahoma. None of that matters anymore. Here's what matters. Have you been redeemed by grace? And are you living it out in a tangible way? And so Jesus literally paints these pictures of people who should have done the right thing. They're the ones that are blessed. They're favored of God. They were born into the position, and they went exactly against what everyone thought they were going to do. Many have speculated that the priest and the Levite ignored the half-dead man because they were afraid of becoming ritually unclean, which would then make them unable to perform the duties of a priest or a Levite. You've probably, maybe at some point, even heard somebody say something about that, but this wouldn't seem to be the case. First, they were also traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, which indicates that their time of service at the temple was over. They had done their service, they were returning home, so ritual impurity would not keep them from doing anything. Second, the priests and the Levites were required by the law to bury a neglected corpse. So if they saw the person and thought that they were already dead, they were morally and religiously obligated to go and to take care of the corpse. Third, there was nothing in the law that would require them to not intervene to save a life. In fact, the exact opposite were true. You could set aside all of the purity commands of the law if it meant saving another human being's life. So if they thought that the man was half dead, again, they were morally and religiously obligated to intervene on his behalf and to take care of him. So these people were the ones who should have taken care of the man. But guess what? They didn't. So why don't they help him? That is a really great question. And here's what's really interesting. Jesus never answered it. Everyone listening to him would have been wondering, why isn't the priest helping? They all would have been thinking, why didn't the Levite help? Jesus gives no answer to why they didn't. No legitimate reason at all why the priest and the Levite wouldn't help the injured man. All we are told is that they saw him, they knew he was in need, and they passed by on the other side of the road. That's all we're told. The last person that Jesus introduced was the Samaritan. The Samaritan is the most famous person in the parable, but in Jesus' day, the Samaritans were hated by the Jews. The Jews considered them half-breeds. They did not follow all of the Jewish Bible, and they had even built their own temple. And so by making the most hated person the hero of the story, Jesus draws attention to the willingness to simply meet the need because there is a need. That's it. The Samaritan wasn't concerned with his own title. He wasn't concerned with his own position, nor was he concerned with the title or the position of the person who was in need. He simply did what was right because it was right. Now that's a pretty profound thing to do, isn't it? Just doing the right thing because it's the right thing. Think about what we call the golden rule. Jesus taught the golden rule just like he taught the parable of the Good Samaritan. In our culture, we grow so familiar with these teachings that we kind of miss the point sometimes. But listen to this in Matthew 7:12. So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them. For this is the law and the prophets. What is he saying? He's saying all of the stuff about following God. All of the, how do I follow God? How do I demonstrate that I love God? This is what Jesus said. Whatever you wish that someone else would do for you, do that for them. And if you'll just do that, all of your questions about serving God are answered. That's pretty profound. I mean, that's a pretty bold statement. There's action involved in this. This is not just about not being a jerk. Well, I fulfilled the golden rule. Somebody cut me off in traffic and I didn't flip them off. Well, no. This is about being actively involved in the lives of broken people around us. That's what we're talking about. And that leads us to the second truth this parable teaches. To do the right thing, we must be personally involved. You cannot farm the right thing out to someone else. If you're going to do the right thing, you're going to have to do the right thing. Look again at the parable, Luke 10:33 and 34. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was. When he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him, bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, then set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. The priest, the Levite, the Samaritan all saw the man and they all saw his need. Only the Samaritan became personally involved. The 3rd century Roman playwright Plautus once said, "He who means well is useless unless he does well." It means we got to get involved. There are too many Christians who know there are needs all around them and would like to do something about them, but fall short of actually doing something. It's the personal involvement that they struggle with. And in this parable, the Samaritan took the risk of being personally involved with the person who was in need. He came to where the man was. He was in a place where people could be in need. He didn't shelter himself from the brokenness of the world around him. Instead, he was in the place of brokenness. He had compassion on him. True compassion is not simply feeling bad for someone. True compassion is being moved to help. He went to him. The Samaritan put himself at risk by going to the man who was injured. He was not willing to simply pass by on the other side of the road. The concerns of his day became secondary to the needs of the other person. He bound up his wounds, pouring in oil and wine. He actually knew how to take care of someone. He actually knew how to take care of his needs. He knew what to do with a person who was hurting. Can you imagine that? It says he put him on his own beast, his own animal, his own donkey, and he brought him to an inn. He did everything he could to make sure the person could get to the place where he could be helped. So few Christians actually ask hurting people to come to church with them, much less go and pick them up and bring them to church. But this is what the guy did. I know where you can get help. I'm going to take you to where you can get help. That's pretty powerful. Jesus is calling us to something much deeper. Listen to what Paul wrote to the church in Corinth, 2 Corinthians 12:15. I will most gladly spend and be spent for your souls. That's personal involvement. Paul says, I will give of myself if it means that you can be made right with Jesus. Paul understands the heart of Jesus. He declares that he will sacrifice himself for the spiritual growth of others. This is what Jesus is calling all of us to do. So this leads us to the third truth this parable teaches. To do the right thing, we must be personally invested. Let's look at the parable again. Luke 10:35. It says, and the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back. The Samaritan in the parable was not only personally involved, but he put his money into play as well. He gave the man 2 full days of income, and he promised to cover any other additional expenses. Think about that. That's 2 full days of work on a stranger and an obligation. If it goes beyond that, I'll square it up. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said this about our money in Matthew chapter 6. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So according to Forbes, the average annual salary in the United States is $59,428. That's nationwide. That's all 50 states. Obviously, that's the median. Some make a lot more, some make a lot less. Some states have higher median income, some states have lower. But that would mean that the average Christian would tithe $5,942.80 a year based on that, because you move the decimal. However, according to Health Research Funding, the average churchgoer gives $884 a year to their church. Again, this is the average. Some give way more than that. Some give way, way less. So if the median income is around $59,000 a year, and annual average giving per person is less than $900 a year, that represents less than 1.5% of the average income being given to the church. This is always interesting to me because I will continually hear people who go to church say that tithing is an Old Testament rule that we don't have to live by under the New Covenant. Say, Pastor, you talk about the tithe, that's Old Covenant. Okay, let's say you're right. Let's go with your argument. Even if that's true, where is there any place in the Gospels that Jesus commanded his followers to do less than what was required in the Old Testament? Jesus said, you're worried about murder. I'm telling you, don't even hate someone. He said, you're worried about adultery. Let me talk to you about lust. What in the Gospels would lead us to believe that he would lower the bar? His invitations are always greater than the demands of the law. Christian author Randy Alcorn, in his book Money, Possessions, and Eternity, said this: when we as New Testament believers living in a far more affluent society than ancient Israel give only a fraction of that given by the poorest Old Testament believers, we surely must reevaluate our concept of grace giving. And when you consider that we have the indwelling of the Spirit of God and they didn't, the contrast becomes even more glaring. We believe that a heart touched by God wants to be generous. Our problem isn't that we don't believe in tithing or that we don't believe in generosity. Our problem is that we love our money more than we love God or other people. This is exactly why Jesus said what he did in Matthew 6, verse 24. No one can serve two masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. So now that we've looked at the parable, there are no amens left. I want us to examine the conversation around the parable, because this is where we really begin to get into what's going on. With this particular parable, the conversation before and after the parable is equally important to the parable itself. The conversation teaches us a couple things. First, when we know what we should do, we shouldn't try to justify why we aren't doing it. When we know what we should do, we shouldn't try to justify why we aren't doing it. Look again at Luke 10, verse 25. It says, and behold, a lawyer stood up to put him to the test, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? He said to him, what's written in the law? How do you read it? And he answered, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, you have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live. But he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, and who is my neighbor? So the expert in the law obviously knew what God wanted, because Jesus even commended him for his answer. Jesus said, you got it right. You hit the nail on the head. You know exactly what's expected of you. The problem wasn't a lack of knowledge, but a lack of action. Rather than admitting that he had failed to keep the commandments, he shifted the blame. According to him, the problem was not his lack of effort. The problem was that the law did not explain who his neighbor actually was. His implication is that if he only knew who his neighbor was, he'd love him. So basically, he's saying it's God's fault that I'm not keeping this law because God has not been clear enough. And let's not throw him all the way under the bus because there's a lot of room down there for us as well. Right? See, he's saying, if I only knew. Unfortunately, we're still trying to justify our lack of activity today. It's not that we don't know what needs to be done or that people are in need. It's just that we don't do anything. Since we can't admit that we're not doing anything, we have to find a way to justify our lack of action. Listen to what James wrote in his letter, James 4:17. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. We think of sin as what we go out and do, and James is saying sin is the things that you're not going and doing. So when we know what we should be doing and we don't need to justify why we're not doing it. We just need to start doing the right things. There's another thing the conversation around the parable teaches us. Teaches us that we should pay more attention to the question Jesus is asking us instead of the questions we are asking Jesus. Again, in Luke 10, verse 29, it says, "But he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, 'And who is my neighbor?'" Then at the end of the parable in verse 36, Jesus says this, "Which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers?" And this may seem like something that's really simple, but the implications are revolutionary. The parable of the Good Samaritan might be the most famous parable in all of the world, but we miss the point of it by not examining these questions. The expert in the law asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" Jesus asked the teacher of the law who was a neighbor. And the man wanted to know who his neighbor was and who was not his neighbor. That way, he would know who he needed to love and who he could get away with not loving. And Jesus refused to answer the question. Remember that the person asking who his neighbor was hated the hero of Jesus' story. So many people think that, Jesus was just this positive and unoffensive teacher who didn't deal with the real world issues that were going on. And that could not be further from the truth. In this encounter, Jesus is directly condemning hatred, racism, bigotry, nationalism, and tribalism. What do you think Jesus would say to us in our current political and cultural climate? One commentator on this parable had this to say, "If we do not intend to tell people how to live, why bother with teaching or preaching?" Jesus and all the New Testament writers clearly did not hesitate to instruct people about how they should live. We are doomed to failure as long as the church refuses to take seriously what Jesus actually said about lifestyle issues. Keeping the commands, loving one's enemies, helping the poor, and doing the will of the Father. Here's our problem. We live in a world where we are bombarded by media trying to divide us and to pit one group against the other. And this may be fine for the rest of the culture, but shouldn't those who follow Jesus think and behave differently? Our culture tells us that if you're a Republican, you should hate Democrats. If you're a Democrat, you should hate Republicans. If you're conservative, you should hate liberals. If you're liberal, you should hate conservatives. If you're black, you hate white people. If you're white, you hate everyone. If you're rich, you hate the poor. If you're poor, you hate the rich. If you're an immigrant, you hate citizens. If you're a citizen, you hate immigrants. If you are for abortion, you hate people who are against abortion. If you are against abortion, you hate people who are for it. If you are not confused about your sexual identity, you hate those who are. If you are confused about your sexual identity, you hate those who aren't. If you think Israel is right, you hate Palestinians. If you think Palestine is right, you hate Jews. If you're a Razorback fan, you hate Sooners fans. If you're a Sooners fan, you hate Razorback fans. Where and when does it stop? Where do we, as followers of Jesus, finally draw the line? Who is going to actually be positive and live differently? Jesus would never for 1 second justify sin. And he would never ask you and me to justify sin. But he does call us to love people differently. Look at what he said when he was asked what the most important commandment from God was. Matthew 22, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment, and a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. So this brings us back to the parable of the Good Samaritan. Jesus never answered the lawyer's question and refused to tell him who his neighbor was. Instead, he told him the parable of the Good Samaritan. Then he asked if the priest, the Levite, or the Samaritan was a neighbor. And the answer was obvious. It was obvious. It was the Samaritan. Why? Because he helped the person in need. And then Jesus told the expert in the law to go out and act like the Samaritan. You know the person in the story that you hate? Go act like he did. Here's what's revolutionary. Jesus told him to quit worrying about who his neighbor is and start being a neighbor to every person he came in contact with. The cool thing is that if you are expending effort to be a good neighbor, you don't even have time to worry about who your neighbor is. Listen to what the Apostle Paul tells us in Colossians 3. If then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on things that are on earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden in Christ. He's calling us to think differently. And because we think differently, we will act differently. The parable of the Good Samaritan is about living differently. It's about thinking and loving the way that Jesus thinks and loves, not the way our world does. It's about realizing we've died to ourselves and we've died to this world, and now our lives are hidden in Christ, so we should live like Jesus would live.
We hope you enjoyed listening to our podcast. For more information, you can find us at evangeltemple.life or check us out on social media under Evangel Temple Assembly of God. We hope you have a great week.